Hello everybody and welcome to the Forge's 13th episode of Ignite. Hopefully everybody is doing well. Ignite, is for anyone that hasn't seen this before, is our short webinar really to tackle some of the industry challenges that are going on in the insights and strategy world. Last week we heard from Sue Ferrance and Gareth Hutchins. They're both co-founders of a small children's toy and accessory startup called Seahorsey. They have both worked in corporate roles, but they have set this startup on the side. So they share some of the interesting challenges that they faced in going from the corporate world to the startup world. So anyone that is working for a corporate or is interested in startup culture, how to bring that into a large organization, they shared some really interesting insights there. So that's well worth a listen. You can find that on our social channels. This week, continuing on the innovation theme, we're going to be listening to Forge founder Simon Garnett, who's going to be talking to us about why we find innovation so challenging. So there's been a long-running statistic that, the majority of innovation fails. We're going to be digging into why that is, looking at some of the myths that exist within organizations and how to bust some of those. So as with previous talks, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. You can post them directly to me if you want to remain anonymous. We'll pick those up at the end. We will also be recording this talk and sending it out. So that will be going up to our channels later on this week and early next week. So that's enough from me. Over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Adam. Well, thank you all for joining. Lovely to have you here. So as Adam said, we're going to talk a little bit about why do we struggle with innovation. And it's a very deliberate image that I put there because this analogy I talk about quite a lot when it comes to innovation. I talk about shortening the odds in our favor. And why is that? Well, I'm sorry to start with some depressing figures, but it's important. Nielsen research showing that 80% of NPD launches fail within the first year. That's from October last year. 2/3, 60% of new businesses going under, startups going under within 3 years, 20% closing their doors within just 12 months from January this year. The reality is, I remember when I was at Diageo 13, 14, 15 years ago, something like that. And some Nielsen analysis had been done, which showed that 80 to 85% of innovation fails within a year. So in 15 years, we've really not got any better at it, which is quite a sort of sobering fact, really, when we think about it. And when you think about the amount of effort and energy that goes into innovation, how much resource it takes up, both human and actual financial resource, I think it's fair to ask the question, why do we bother? This is a low odds game. But there is a reason we bother and why the industry continues to focus on innovation. And it's a word that we all know. And it's this word disruption. That is our normal. I've just chosen 4 branded examples here, but frankly, I could have put 400 on this slide. There are disruption everywhere in every category. If you think for a second your category is immune, well, so do probably lots of austere looking men and women who walk around with top hats and carry and drive hearses. But it's happening in funeral care. People are coming in and saying, actually, that old model, that way of doing it is not the way I want to. We can disrupt it. We can change it. So disruption is absolutely everywhere. And with that, I think has created, well, let's be honest, some myths. I hear a lot of conversation amongst my clients, which is almost mystifying or mythologizing these disruptors. This idea that they're almost magic, that they're achieving something that none of the rest of us can do, that they have shortened the odds so substantially in their favor that they must be doing something wildly different to the rest of us. And that's not constructive, because the reality is what that creates is a sense of otherworldliness almost about these businesses, that what they're achieving isn't available to the rest of us. And I don't think that's true, and I don't think it's helpful. So what I'm going to share with you in the next sort of 10 or so minutes is just 4 myths and realities of innovation and what you can do to shorten the innovation odds within your business. So if any of you have heard me talk about innovation before, then it's time to get your bingo cards out and mark your first word, because here it is: innovation loves focus, my favorite phrase that we ever talk about when it comes to innovation. what's the myth? I think there is this problem that a lot of these disruptive businesses, there's a kind of mythology that's sort of arisen about them, that they're just creative companies who are just able to constantly pluck ideas out of thin air. You know, the mythology of Steve Jobs as just this kind of idea guy who was just able to just come up with idea after idea magically and make them. And I just think that's not true. I think the reality is that actually they're deeply, deeply focused businesses that absolutely subscribe to that old David Ogilvy kind of maxim of the creative freedom of a tightly written brief. So what can you do about that? Well, the first thing and most important thing is follow the money. Heresy, I can imagine some people shouting who might be looking at this going, how can you talk about disruptors and start with follow the money? This should be about making the world better. This should be about purpose. This should be about saving the planet. Yeah, I get that. And I'm not arguing that being driven by a higher cause, a purpose, isn't important. As Adam said, we had Gareth and Zhu on last week, and anyone who heard them speak, you can't help but be touched by their sense of purpose and how they're driven by this desire to make the world a better place for their own children. But I fundamentally also know that they know there's money there. They've seen that, and they know that that is something where people are willing to invest their money. It's the old cliche, the old maxim of there might be a gap in the market, but is there a market in the gap? And you can't be driven by purpose alone if there's not money there. There's a reason why 60% of startups ultimately fail. And a lot of that reason is they run out of cash. They run out of cash because there's just not enough market there in that opportunity. The second thing I think is really important is thinking about both the where and the how. We see so many innovation briefs where we're focused on one or the other. So a growing subsegment where we want to focus, or a particular trend that we really want to leverage and deliver how we create our product. But it's essential that we have both parts. And then the final one I want to talk about is time up front. You know, agile working is the cliche of the day. Everyone's embracing it. And with this fetishization of agile working and startup culture, there is also with that a real temptation for a lot of businesses just to jump into action, jump into ideation, just go, 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 more ideas, quicker, faster, bang. Again, I disagree with that. I think when you look at these businesses, what they do really well is spending time up front to get incredibly clear on what the opportunity is. Then they move with real pace through the commercialization. These, I should have said, these 4 principles I'm going to talk you through are really focused on that innovation strategy, that upfront identification of an opportunity, and then kind of creating the idea. I'm not so much talking about the commercialization and the things downstream, but the reason why so much of that can happen faster in these disruptive agile businesses is because of the time they've invested up front to get really, really clear on where the opportunity lies. Second one I'm going to talk to you about is a little bit about points of parity and points of difference. I think there's also a myth that successful disruptive innovation are completely revolutionary ideas that have never been seen before. And even if we just pause there, I think everything that we know about humanity would tell us that's probably not the case. We are pattern-seeking animals. We like things that help us make sense of the world around us. If things are completely different to anything we've ever seen before, we have no benchmark. We have no ability to kind of engage with them. And the reality actually of many of these businesses is what they've done so well is got the balance right between ticking the boxes, if you like, of the important things of parity. So the things that people do value or help them make sense or help them decode the idea, but then majoring on the specific point, or in some instances, points of difference. Again, what can we do about that? Well, the first thing is to couch it in behavior. We are not short of choice, generally. When was the last time you stood at a fixture in a shop and thought, do you know what? I really don't have a choice here. Most of the time, we've got plenty of choice, and we're weighing up different things amongst that. So we need to understand, what are people doing? Why are they doing it? What is working? What isn't working? What are we really competing with? What's driving that choice? How do we then deliver value in that context? So what are the things that we need to retain because they're integral as to why people are shopping in that way in the first place or behaving in that way in the first place? What are the bits that we can then take and really major on and disrupt in a different way that will really help people reframe a category? The second point, I think, is one that we are probably all very aware of, but it never hurts to repeat. We need to be realistic. The reality is that people think about your category, your brand, far less than you think they do, far less than we would like them to. And we need to be ruthlessly realistic about what they actually care about versus what we would like them to care about. I'm not meaning to pick on an industry, but I think often like the white goods industry and the technology industry, the car industry, they're industries that are packed full of features and benefits and additional things. But do people actually care about that stuff in the same way that the manufacturers and producers do? Or are they engaged in a very different way? Finally, I think the point of discernment is really important. I think these businesses are very, very good and ruthless about focusing on what matters and then leaving out things if they aren't delivering. That's hard. We have loss aversion. We don't like to let go of things. But if you want your points of parity and points of difference, you need to allow for some things to be implicitly discovered, because that then gives you the freedom to make certain things, your points of difference, explicit and really shout about them. The third one is insight isn't found, insight is forged. Obviously, it'll be familiar to many of you, given it's the core principle of our business. I think there is a real myth, and it's this eureka moment of insight or inspiration. Stephen Johnson, in his great books, I think it's called Where Ideas Come From. He talks about the fact that this idea of this singular moment of inspiration just isn't true. Actually, it's often bringing together multiple different perspectives. I will talk a lot about ideas and insights aren't born perfect. They take time, they take effort to refine them, to build them, to make them as powerful as possible. So again, the first, three things to do here. I think the first one is just this embracing multiple different approaches. We call them ask, watch, dig, predict. You might call them system 1, system 2, maybe even system 3 if you're so engaged with new systems. But the point is, however you approach it, embrace multiple different approaches and perspectives. The second point is about embracing outliers. This is really important. We are sense-making beings at our very core, so we don't like things that don't make sense. We're naturally suspicious of things that kind of go against what we think it should be. But if we embrace the contradictions, the exceptions, the things that don't make sense, then we fall into a trap of making humans robotic, rational beings. We're not. We're deeply flawed, contradictory humans. We make wildly contradictory behaviors and statements every day. We need to embrace those. We need to use them to challenge the norms. And then finally, it's about making sure that we go beyond data and information. Insight absolutely can't be built without data and information, but let's also be very, very clear. It certainly isn't just data and information. And if we don't ask those deeper questions, why, we will never get to those kind of deeper bits. And then finally, being pragmatic. And this is probably my favorite of the four, to be honest, something I'm very passionate about. When I wrote this slide, I started off by the myth that commercialism kills creativity. And then I thought, is that still really true? I know, 5, 10, 15 years ago, that was still true. But you know what? Sadly, I think it is still true. I was in a workshop just the other day where someone said, right, guys, no such thing as a bad idea, blue sky thinking, no boundaries, go, where are you going to go? And I had to put my hand up and say, sorry, I just don't believe in this. I don't believe that commercialism kills creativity. In fact, not only can they exist, they must exist, because it's our real world. Our world has constraints. Every world has constraints. We live with them every single day. That doesn't mean we can't come up with new creative solutions to them. But if we don't acknowledge them, if we pretend that we're living in this kind of weird alternate reality where we can do anything and we can achieve anything, then all we're doing is delaying the inevitable. I think, I spent 5 or 6 years in innovation client side, and I often think that, a lot of people in the insight industry, we think that the hard bit of innovation is coming up with the idea in the first place. But I know from my own experience that that's the easy bit. The hard bit is the commercializing. It's the constant working out of how we are going to compromise between the ideal and the reality that we can actually produce and actually sell and get into our customers. And so at some point, cold-hearted commercial realism hits idealism. And if you don't accept that from the front, all you're doing is just delaying the inevitable, which is you have to face it at some point. So I'd really encourage you to embrace challenge. Don't put your heads in the sand. face into the constraints, and really importantly, use creativity to overcome them. This is not about saying, all right, we're constrained and we can't do anything else. We can, but if you don't know what the constraints are, you can't find a solution to them. The second thing I believe very strongly is giving it time. There is such a thing as a bad idea. There are many bad ideas. I have had many of them in my career. I'm sure none of you have, because you're brilliantly intelligent and marvelous, but it is a reality. It happens. The point, though, is it's quite hard to know instantly if an idea is bad. If your gut reaction saying an idea is bad, well, gut reaction oftentimes is based on past experience. And past experience is what we're trying to change when it comes to disruption. We're trying to do things in a different way. So that past experience might be right, it might be valid, but it might not be. It might just be that it doesn't fit with your constraints. That's why disruptors and these startup businesses are so good, because they don't have those constraints. They don't have the legacy systems and production facilities. So give it time, challenge assumptions, live with that bit of discomfort. And then finally, I would just say use your strengths. I think there is, again, with this slight fetishization of startups and disruptors, there's often a temptation to kind of go, oh, we need to throw everything out about what we do and we need to become a startup. Well, let's be honest, you can't become a startup. Big established businesses are not startups. It's not in their DNA. But that's not a problem, because lots of things are in their DNA. Amazing science, brilliant manufacturing capability, incredible production efficiency. These are strengths that so many people in the startup and scale-up world would give their right arm for. So yes, let's borrow the bits that can help us, but let's also recognize that we have significant advantages in being a large corporate, if that is your reality, and embrace that and add to it rather than throwing it out and thinking we just need to change completely. So there you go, 4 very quick myths, and hopefully some guidance there and some thoughts and tips for you as to how you can start to tip the innovation odds in your favor. Couple of minutes I think we've got just left at the end there for any perspectives and experience, and particularly if you want to share any of your own thoughts on myths that we should add to this list. I'm always keen for it to grow. But Adam, I don't know if there are any questions in the meantime.
Yes, just a question here, Simon. I guess it's a question about culture. So, and this might be a myth, people look at, a lot of the startup culture that came out of Silicon Valley and, a lot of the big tech companies of today that have become enormous success stories. And there's this argument that, they embraced failure, you're allowed to fail. Do you think that we need to embrace failure more in sort of traditional legacy businesses, incumbent, organizations? Do you think there's a problem with failure that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. People often ask me what's the kind of sort of most important trend or not trend, behavioral attribute, if you like, for successful innovation. And the thing I always talk about is resilience, because if there's one truth of innovation, it's failure. Everyone has had failure. The stats at the beginning show you 80% fails. You cannot do an innovation client-side role, I think, for more than 12 months, probably 18 months, certainly, without having failed at least once, because it's just the reality. Stuff falls over in the pipeline. That's hard to accept. It's hard to engage with. It's particularly hard because there's a lot of money spent in that up front and kind of knowing it's wasted. I think if people are a little bit more honest up front about some of the practical realities that exist, rather than this sense of no such thing as a bad idea, we've got no constraints, blue sky thinking, I think that might help a little bit. But yeah, I do agree with that, Adam. I think it is very hard. And there is a culture that is absolutely more accepting of failure, both in the kind of startup world, but I think also just generally within American business. I lived in America for a year, and there was almost this sense of, someone always said to me, the hardest thing you're going to have to learn as an Englishman is to be able to say good luck with that in a non-ironic way in America, because actually the reality is they mean it in America. There's like, good luck with it. There's a real pride in trying. And I think particularly in the UK, I'm not sure how strong it is in other. I think in the UK there is a bit of a cynicism about failure, and it's a hard badge to have to carry.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wonder if there's an argument for a failure budget in innovation departments, you know, a target, a KPI around it to sort of embrace it a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's another question here. Should we not look critically at the methods we use to go about market research? So should we critically look at the methods we're using to see if we can find methods that better predict the real behavior of consumers? So
yeah. I think that's a brilliant one. Listen, predicting behavior is unbelievably difficult. Recalling behavior is hard enough for consumers, right? We're not very good at remembering what we have done, yet alone trying to understand what we will do. It's why when I talked a little bit about some of the stuff earlier, I kind of said, really couch it in behavior. What are people doing? What's your source of business? Do you think you're going to win? Why do you think you're going to do it? You know, producing innovation forecast is one of the, you know, in theory, easiest things in the world to do, right? Because you can look at any proxy and go, well, if we get X% of that at Y frequency, you know, with bang, suddenly our numbers, any number you like. It's an easy thing to do. What's much harder is understanding why that is likely to be feasible. And again, I go back to this points of parity, points of difference. What is it that when you say you're going to achieve this, why do you think that is realistic? And again, yes, absolutely right. You know, trying to find the right methodologies to kind of do it. You know, market modeling is not my area of forte. It's not the Forge's area of kind of strength, but absolutely, I think there's a lot that is being done, but continues to need to be done to get better forecasts in that space.
Very good. Thank you. I think that might be all of the questions from now. If anyone does have any other questions, pop them in the chat and we can answer those. But just to wrap up then, so thank you, Simon. Thanks for that. That was really interesting. Coming up next week, same time next week, Thursday, 3 o'clock UK time. We've got a very special guest coming to us, Eric Sampers. Eric Sampers was brand director for Beefeater at Pernod Ricard, had a 16-year career there. He recently left Pernod Ricard to set up a brand new startup, continuing the startup and innovation theme. This time it's focused on the no and low alcoholic drink space. So he set this startup up, it's called Illogical Drinks, and it's there really to try and do something in that space. So we're going to be talking about the opportunity for no and low, what's driving that. Talking to him a little bit about the role for naturals in that space. There's lots of naturals brands in and around no and low. And finally, he's recently tried to launch this brand, obviously in the face of COVID. We're going to be talking to him a little bit about why that has been a challenge. So join us next week for that. Like I said earlier, this will be recorded and going out on the channels, so keep an eye there, and invites will going out for next week, tomorrow. So that's all from us. Thanks very much, and yeah, have a good rest of the week. Bye-bye.